chosen ones. There's a moment that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Nothing collapses, nothing explodes, no clear turning point announces itself. But internally, something shifts. It's subtle at first, almost easy to ignore. You start noticing that the things that used to excite you don't feel the same anymore. Conversations that once felt engaging now feel repetitive. Even certain environments begin to feel off. Not wrong, just no longer aligned. And the strange part is, you can't fully explain why. You try to go back to how things were. You try to reconnect with old habits, old routines, even old versions of yourself. But something inside you resists, not aggressively, just quietly. Like a door that no longer opens the way it used to. This is where most people misunderstand what's happening. They think something is wrong. They think they're losing motivation, losing connection, or drifting away from something important. But what's actually happening is far less dramatic and far more meaningful. You're starting to see things more clearly. Not in a mystical sense, not in a sudden awakening moment, but in a grounded, psychological way. You're noticing patterns. You're recognizing what drains you. You're becoming aware of how much of your life was built on autopilot. And once that awareness begins, it doesn't just go away. When your environment stops matching your energy. One of the most overlooked experiences during personal growth is this quiet mismatch. You can still be in the same room, around the same people, doing the same things. But internally, it feels different. You start picking up on conversations that revolve around the same complaints, the same cycles, the same limitations. And instead of feeling connected to it, you feel distant from it. Not because you think you're better, but because you're no longer in the same mental space. This creates a kind of internal tension. You don't necessarily want to disconnect from people. You don't suddenly reject everything around you, but you can't fully engage the same way either. So you exist in this in-between state, present but not fully involved. And this can feel isolating, because from the outside nothing has changed, but internally everything feels slightly out of sync. This is where many people start doubting themselves. They wonder if they're overthinking, if they're becoming too distant, if they're the problem. But this shift is actually a natural part of growth. As your awareness changes, your tolerance for certain patterns changes too. Things that once felt normal now feel repetitive. Things that once felt meaningful now feel surface level. And it's not because those things suddenly lost value. It's because your perspective evolved. The discomfort of seeing too much. There's a side of growth that isn't often talked about. It's not the motivation, it's not the clarity. It's the discomfort. Because once you start noticing patterns, you can't unsee them. You begin to recognize behaviors, not just in others but in yourself. You notice when you're reacting instead of responding. You notice when you're seeking validation instead of acting with intention. You notice how often people avoid uncomfortable truths. And this awareness can feel heavy. Not overwhelming in a dramatic way, but quietly exhausting. Because now you're more conscious. And being conscious requires energy. It requires you to pause before reacting, to think before speaking, to reflect instead of defaulting. And that's not always easy, especially when the world around you continues moving on autopilot. This is where growth starts to feel lonely. Not because you're alone, but because your internal experience is no longer shared in the same way. Why you no longer fit into old versions of yourself. At some point, you might try to go back. Back to how you used to think. Back to how you used to react. Back to the version of yourself that felt simpler. But something stops you. Not forcefully, just naturally. Because growth doesn't just add new layers, it replaces old ones. And once a mindset shifts, it's difficult to fully return to the previous one. You might still remember how you used to see things, but you can't unknow what you know now. This is one of the truths most people overlook. Growth isn't always about gaining something. Sometimes it's about losing the ability to stay the same, losing the comfort of old patterns, losing the ease of unconscious behavior. And while that might sound negative, it's actually a sign of progress, because it means your awareness is expanding, the internal shift no one can see. From the outside, people may not notice anything different about you. You still show up. You still talk, work, interact. But internally, there's a shift happening that isn't visible. You're thinking more deeply. You're questioning more. You're becoming more intentional with your time, your energy, your attention. And this creates a gap between how you feel and how you appear, which can be frustrating, because it's hard to explain a change that isn't visible. You can't easily describe why certain things don't feel right anymore, or why you're pulling back from situations that used to feel normal. So instead, you stay quiet. You observe. You process. And over time, that internal shift becomes your new baseline. When you stop seeking constant noise. Another subtle change that often goes unnoticed is your relationship with noise. Not just physical noise, but mental noise. Constant scrolling, constant distractions, constant input. At some point, it starts to feel overwhelming rather than entertaining. You begin to crave stillness, moments where nothing is happening, where you're not consuming, reacting, or comparing, just being. And this shift can feel unfamiliar at first, because most people are used to filling every empty moment. But once you experience that clarity, that quiet, you realize how much noise you were carrying before. And more importantly, how unnecessary most of it was. The truth about outgrowing certain things. Outgrowing something doesn't mean it was wrong. It just means it no longer fits. This is a difficult truth to accept, because we tend to associate growth with improvement and distance with rejection. But in reality, growth is neutral. It doesn't judge the past. It simply changes your relationship with it. You can appreciate what something once gave you, and still recognize that it no longer aligns with who you're becoming. And that doesn't require conflict. It doesn't require explanation. Sometimes it just requires acceptance when your reactions start to change. At some point, you begin to notice something small but significant. The way you react isn't the same anymore. Situations that once triggered immediate frustration now create a pause instead. Not because you're forcing yourself to stay calm, but because your mind naturally slows down before responding. You start observing your own reactions as they happen, almost like there's a space between the moment and your response. And in that space, you have a choice. This doesn't mean you suddenly become perfectly composed or unaffected. You still feel things. You still get irritated, disappointed, even overwhelmed at times. But the difference is, you're aware of it while it's happening. And that awareness changes everything. Because instead of being pulled completely into the reaction, you can step back, even slightly, and ask yourself what's actually going on. Is this about the current moment? Or is it connected to something deeper? That simple shift, from reacting to observing, marks a turning point in personal growth. It's not loud, it doesn't feel like a breakthrough, but it quietly reshapes how you experience everything. The slow build of self-trust. There's another change that doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly, almost invisibly. Self-trust. Not the kind that comes from external validation or temporary confidence, but a steady, internal sense of knowing. You begin to rely less on constant reassurance. You don't feel the same need to explain every decision or seek approval before taking action. Instead, you start listening to your own judgment. And at first, that can feel uncomfortable, because trusting yourself means accepting that you won't always get it right. It means taking responsibility for your choices without leaning on others to confirm them. But over time, something shifts. You realize that even when things don't go as planned, you can handle it. You adapt. You learn. You move forward. And that experience builds a quiet confidence. Not loud, not performative. Just steady. Why you start protecting your energy differently. There's a point where you become more selective, not just with people, but with everything. Your time, your attention, your emotional investment. You start noticing how certain interactions leave you feeling drained, while others feel neutral or even energizing. And instead of ignoring that difference, you begin to respect it. This doesn't mean cutting people off abruptly or becoming distant. It means setting boundaries in subtle ways, spending less time in conversations that feel repetitive, choosing not to engage in unnecessary conflict, allowing yourself to step back without over-explaining. And this shift isn't about control, it's about awareness. You're no longer giving your energy automatically. You're choosing where it goes. And that choice becomes one of the most important forms of self-respect, the difference between isolation and intentional space. At first, this phase can feel like isolation. You might find yourself spending more time alone, thinking more, reflecting more. And it's easy to misinterpret that as disconnection. But there's a difference between isolation and intentional space. Isolation feels heavy. It feels like something is missing. Intentional space feels different. It feels calm, even when it's quiet. It feels like you're reconnecting with something internal, rather than losing something external. This is where a lot of people get confused. They assume that being alone automatically means something is wrong. But in reality, it can be one of the most important parts of growth. Because without space, there's no clarity. Without distance, there's no perspective. And without stillness, it's difficult to hear your own thoughts clearly. When you stop needing everything to make sense. Earlier in life, there's often a strong need for clarity. You want to understand everything. Why things happen. Why people act the way they do. Why certain situations unfold the way they do. But over time, that need starts to soften. Not because you stop caring, but because you realize that not everything requires a clear explanation. Some things are simply complex. Some behaviors don't have a simple answer. Some outcomes aren't fully within your control. And instead of trying to force understanding, you begin to accept uncertainty. This doesn't mean you stop thinking critically. It means you stop exhausting yourself trying to resolve everything immediately. You allow things to exist without rushing to define them. And that creates a sense of mental space. A kind of quiet acceptance that wasn't there before. The shift from external validation to internal stability. At some point, you start noticing how much of your earlier decisions were influenced by external feedback. Approval, recognition, agreement. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's part of being human. But as you grow, that dependence starts to decrease. You begin to measure things differently. Instead of asking, does this make sense to others? You start asking, does this feel right to me? And that question changes your priorities. You become less focused on proving something, less concerned with how everything appears, more focused on whether your actions align with your values. This doesn't mean you ignore feedback completely. It means you no longer depend on it to define your direction. And that creates a kind of internal stability that isn't easily shaken. When you realize growth isn't always visible. One of the most overlooked truths is that growth often looks ordinary. There's no clear milestone, no moment where everything suddenly changes. Instead, it shows up in small ways. The conversations you choose not to engage in, the reactions you manage differently, the thoughts you question instead of accepting automatically. From the outside, these changes are almost invisible. But internally, they add up. They reshape how you think, how you respond, how you experience your own life. And because it's not dramatic, it's easy to underestimate. It's easy to feel like nothing is happening. But in reality, these quiet shifts are what create long-term change. The point where you start arisogenizing your own patterns. Eventually, your awareness turns inward more consistently. You start seeing your own patterns more clearly. Not just occasionally, but regularly. You notice recurring thoughts, recurring reactions, recurring habits. And instead of judging them, you start studying them. You become curious. Why do I respond this way? What triggers this reaction? What belief is behind this habit? And this curiosity replaces a lot of unnecessary self-criticism. Because instead of labeling something as good or bad, you start understanding it. And understanding creates the possibility for change. Not forced change, but natural, gradual adjustment, when your identity begins to shift quietly. At a certain point, it's not just your habits or reactions that change. It's your sense of identity. Not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, ongoing shift. You stop defining yourself based on old roles, old expectations, old narratives, and instead, you begin to see yourself as something more flexible, less fixed, more adaptable. You're not trying to become someone completely different. You're allowing yourself to evolve. And that evolution isn't always comfortable, because identity is tied to familiarity. And when that familiarity changes, it can feel uncertain. But it also creates space. Space to grow beyond limitations you didn't even realize you had. Where this all leads, all of these shifts, your reactions, your awareness, your sense of self, they're not separate. They're connected. They build on each other over time. And while it might not feel like a clear path, there is a direction. Not toward a perfect version of yourself, but toward a more aware one, a more intentional one, a version of you that understands your own patterns, your own needs, your own boundaries. And that kind of clarity doesn't happen all at once. It develops slowly, through observation, through reflection, through experience. A simple thought to leave you with. If any part of this feels familiar, you don't need to label it. You don't need to define exactly where you are or what it means. Sometimes it's enough to simply notice, to recognize that something is changing, and to give yourself the space to understand it at your own pace. If you want, you can share your experience, what you've been noticing, what's been shifting for you lately. Not as a statement, just as a reflection. And sometimes, putting that into words is where even more clarity begins. When clarity becomes your new normal. There comes a point where the confusion that once felt constant starts to fade. Not completely, but enough that you notice the difference. You're no longer second-guessing every thought. You're no longer overanalyzing every decision. There's a kind of internal steadiness that begins to take shape. And it doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from understanding yourself better. You start recognizing what aligns with you and what doesn't, without needing endless validation or external confirmation. Decisions become quieter, more intentional, less reactive. And even when uncertainty is still there, it doesn't feel overwhelming in the same way. Because now, you trust your ability to navigate it. That's the shift most people overlook. Clarity isn't about certainty. It's about stability within uncertainty. When you stop chasing and start aligning. Earlier, there's often a sense of chasing. Chasing outcomes. Chasing recognition. Chasing a version of life that feels right. But over time, that energy changes. You're no longer chasing in the same way. You're aligning. You begin focusing less on forcing things to happen and more on whether they fit naturally into your life. You start asking different questions. Does this feel sustainable? Does this reflect who I'm becoming? Does this add something meaningful or just temporary distraction? And those questions reshape your direction. Because instead of moving out of pressure or comparison, you're moving from awareness, from intention. And that shift changes not just what you pursue, but how you experience it. The quiet confidence that need to prove anything. Confidence starts to look different at this stage. It's no longer about being the loudest in the room. It's no longer about proving a point or being seen in a certain way. It becomes quieter, more grounded. You don't feel the same urgency to explain yourself. You don't feel the need to convince others that you're on the right path. Because internally, you already know. And that knowing doesn't require constant reinforcement. It's steady. It allows you to move through situations without needing to control how everything is perceived. And that creates a kind of freedom, not from responsibility, but from unnecessary pressure. When you realize you don't need to return to who you were, there's often a moment where you reflect on your past self, not with judgment, but with awareness. You see the patterns you used to follow, the decisions you used to make, the mindset you used to carry. And for a brief moment, there might be a sense of nostalgia, a thought that maybe things felt simpler back then. But alongside that thought, there's something else. Clarity. Because even if things were simpler, they weren't necessarily aligned. And you recognize that going back isn't really an option. Not because you're forcing yourself forward, but because you've that version naturally. You've seen too much, understood too much, experienced too much, and that awareness becomes part of you. So instead of trying to return, you start accepting where you are now. And more importantly, who you're becoming, the long-term shift most people never talk about. The biggest change isn't something that happens in a single moment. It's something that builds over time. Quietly, consistently. It's the way you think differently now. The way you pause before reacting. The way you choose what deserves your energy. The way you understand yourself on a deeper level. And none of these changes are dramatic on their own. But together, they reshape your entire experience. They influence your decisions, your relationships, your priorities, your direction. And the most important part is, this shift is sustainable. It's not based on temporary motivation. It's built on awareness. And awareness doesn't fade the way motivation does. It stays. It evolves. It deepens. The version of you that's still forming. Right now, you're not at a final destination. You're in the middle of something. A process that doesn't have a fixed endpoint. And that can feel uncertain at times. Because there's no clear finish line. No moment where everything is fully complete. But that's also what makes it real. Because growth isn't about reaching a perfect version of yourself. It's about continuing to evolve, to adjust, to refine, to understand. And every stage of that process matters, even the parts that feel unclear, even the moments that don't feel like progress, because those moments are where the deeper changes happen. A strong but honest closing thought. If you've been noticing these shifts in yourself, the way you think differently, the way you respond differently, the way certain things no longer feel the same, that's not something to ignore. And it's not something you need to rush to define either. It's something to recognize, because not everyone takes the time to notice these changes. Not everyone pauses long enough to reflect on their own patterns, their own growth, their own direction. And that awareness on its own is meaningful. Not because it makes you different from others, but because it puts you in a position to understand yourself more clearly. And when you understand yourself clearly, your decisions become clearer too. Your direction becomes more intentional. Your life becomes more aligned with who you actually are, not just who you were used to being. If this resonated with you on any level, don't just move on from it. Take a moment and actually think about what stood out. What part felt familiar? What shift have you been noticing in your own life lately? You don't need to have the perfect words for it, but putting it into words, even briefly, can help you understand it better. And if you're open to it, share that in the comments. Not for validation, just as a reflection. Because sometimes, reading different perspectives can help you see your own experience more clearly. And if you want more content like this, real, grounded conversations about growth, mindset, and personal change, then you can stay connected here. No pressure, just something to return to when you feel like it. Because this kind of awareness isn't something you finish. It's something you continue to build, step by step, in your own way.